Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure to once again welcome you all to our SPME BDS webinar series. And as always, we have the privilege of talking to Alex Jaffe, the editor of our BDS Monitor. We'll be discussing the latest trends politically, culturally, and academically, of course, as far as where things are going these days, especially post the elections, and what we might expect going forward as things accelerate in the Middle East, and of course, how the environment is taking place and shaping out at the end of this fall-winter semester. As always, those of you who have been with us in the past know, Alex will talk for about a half hour, then we will go into Q&A. All you have to do to ask any questions is type in your question via the chat, and we will do our best to respond in a timely fashion. We will do our best to get to all of the questions this afternoon. If we don't get to your questions, obviously, please feel free to email us after the webinar, and we will do our best to respond in a timely fashion all around. So really, thank you again for joining us. And really, without further ado, Alex, the virtual floor is once again yours.
Terrific. Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody for being here. And I hope everybody has managed to survive the fall semester and the election season with at least a little bit of your sanity intact. Last time, which I think was some time ago, maybe the end of August or beginning of September, when I did one of these broadcasts, I spoke about a lot of abstractions. So I want to be a little bit more concrete this time. Although I cannot resist the temptation to begin with a quote from Lenin about the famous quote that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen, and that's where I think we're at since the election. The internal and the external contexts for anti-Semitism and for BDS have changed rather significantly, and the movement of events has been really tremendous in terms of speed and intensity and diversity of events. This doesn't mean, of course, necessarily that things are going to improve in our with regard to our concerns, but I want to be, perhaps it's the holiday season. I want to be offer a sliver of uncharacteristic positivity. Those of you who've listened to this broadcast before know that I'm not characteristically terribly positive, but maybe there are reasons to be a little bit more optimistic. So to get on to really the obvious, the internal context, the election, a fairly resounding victory for Donald Trump and the Republicans taking over the House and the Senate, the defeat of a number of squad members in various House elections, and the external context, the almost complete defeat of Hamas, the destruction, decapitation, defenestration, whatever you want to call it, of Hezbollah, and the complete collapse of the al-Assad regime in Syria. The resistance axis, the focal point for the Islamo-leftist movements, pointing to precisely these elements, Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria, as well as Iran and the Houthis, as the central forces that are standing up to the evil settler colonialist entity of Israel and the Western imperialism as a whole. Well, they've largely been knocked out of the picture. So, which is obviously good for the people of the Middle East, not least of all for Israel and also for Palestinians and Lebanese, and hopefully, maybe, we hope, not so sure, for Syrians as well. What we've seen since October 7th is the relationship between the internal and the external, the internal forces, movements of which have anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and anti-Westernism as their central motivating contexts, were energized by the massacres that committed by Hamas on October 7th and by the Israeli response. And these forces are the losers now. The forces of internally within the United States, within the West as a whole, which celebrated this resistance axis, which, for example, in London have come out, I think, every Saturday since October 7th, the October 7th massacre, to celebrate the resistance and to oppose the genocide, so-called, committed against the Palestinians by Israel. Well, they're in a different place now. And of course, with the re-election of President Trump, the internal political context has very much been changed. The Biden administration provided material and logistical support to Israel in its campaigns against Hamas and Hezbollah, and a lot of rhetorical support and a lot of political undermining as well. The new Trump administration will be presumed to be much more politically aligned with Israel and with the concerns of American Jews. And these were central, not exclusive, but these were very central concerns during the campaign over the last year, on the part of Trump and to a lesser extent on the part of soon-to-be Vice President Vance, about universities, about anti-Semitism generally, about support in the streets expressed for Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, by various protesters who are part, again, of a generalized movement, an alliance of movements, a unity of fields, as they now call themselves, part of them call themselves. So what can we expect? Well, what's going on? What can we expect? The Trump campaign made universities a central target during the campaign, and threatened, if universities in particular did not address concerns of anti-Semitism and protections for Jewish students, that and the general atmosphere of wokeness, that is to say, what used to be called political correctness, that the administration would address federal funding, research funding, student loan funding, and so on, that it would explore taxing endowments of universities, and would threaten somehow university accreditation, which it would sue universities in federal court for not protecting Jewish students, and so on. How all of this is, and also importantly, deport foreign students who were found to be violating laws and civil rights laws and protesting in favor of terrorist organizations like Hamas. How this is going to work politically and administratively isn't terribly clear, at least to me. Dismantling the Department of Education was a campaign promise by the Trump administration, and this will require an act of Congress to actually do. The Department of Education was created, whatever year, 1970 something, by Congress and can only be undone that way. Executive action will go only so far, and we can expect the resistance, which said the Democrats and their progressive allies, to oppose lots of administration measures. In the education sphere, in the immigration sphere, probably in foreign affairs as well, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Uh, so we don't. It's not entirely clear how this is going to work. I don't know how the federal government goes about instituting taxation of a previously tax exempt university endowment, which in the case of an institution like Harvard, I think is $54 billion or thereabouts. The old joke being that Harvard is a hedge fund with a university attached to it. Similarly, Columbia and New York University are real estate corporations with universities attached to them, and so on. How that's going to work, I don't really know, and I haven't seen a lot of details coming from the administration or its allies. There are a few hints here and there with respect to appointments that the Trump administration has made. One of the most interesting is yesterday, the appointment of Harmeet Dillon to be the head of the Office of Civil Rights in the Justice Department. And she is a vociferous opponent of universities and has advocated publicly to sue them up and down regarding their lack of protections for Jewish students and their treatment of students generally. Interestingly, excuse me, she has come out against the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which has been deliberately stalled in Congress since early in 2024 by outgoing um, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. It was in November, it was attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, and this was opposed by the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Speaker of the House? Again, I'm blanking out. But the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is basically a national codification of the IRA definition. So it has some kind of utility, a broad utility, but it doesn't have a, strictly speaking, a administrative kind of role. It's a series of guidelines, but it's not rhetorical guidelines, theoretical guidelines, you might say, but it doesn't have a strict administrative application. So it's hard to say. And the fact that the hopefully incoming head of the Office of Civil Rights at the Justice Department is opposed to this suggests that the Justice Department will take a much stronger stand against universities and discrimination. What happens with it if the Department of Education is indeed dismantled, which I have a hard time imagining that will happen in the shorter term. The Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education has 70 plus cases that it's actively of anti-Jewish discrimination that it's actively investigating, and slowly settles a case here and a case there. I presume that these cases will be transferred to the Justice Department. But again, too soon to say, very difficult to predict. Overall, though, I think that the takeaway has to be that the administration at a variety of levels and a variety of forms, from the president on downward, the president-elect on downward, is employing a bully pulpit that is threatening and putting fear into the hearts of the higher educational industrial complex, as I call it. And this is having results. And if you look at industry, the trade papers of the higher education biz, you will see a variety of catastrophic predictions about funding, about oversight, about lawsuits, and you'll see some less catastrophic predictions as well. Remember also, and this is very important, a very important point, that this is an industry that is going into a long-term recession in the first place. Um, Interestingly, the Fitch ratings agency just put out last week a prediction that higher education as a sector will shrink in the coming calendar year, and will be subject to financial pressures, largely because of the demographic cliff that is already being experienced by the sector as a whole. There just aren't enough American high school students coming out of the system and going into higher education to sustain the levels of enrollment that have been seen up to now. We've seen the implications in lots of different places already. State systems, such as the state of Pennsylvania, consolidating various campuses, closing campuses, um, in smaller, weaker private institutions, particularly for-profit and smaller sectarian colleges, closing. I think there were about 100 closing last year because their enrollments have collapsed. So this is a sector that's already under pressure, um, partly for reasons that it has no control over. And there are also lots of new reports in the last months and year regarding enrollment patterns, in particular that there is a notable pattern of white males deciding not to go to college. Females have already dominated higher education in enrollment terms for many years, but the number of white males in particular is apparently going down, and they're just deciding, so it seems, that they don't want to go. There's no advantage to them to go, and they'll go into business and vocations and other things. And this is also, this threatens the viability, the long-term profitability of the higher education sector as a whole as well. So it's a sector under threat. And I think in the next year, we're going to see some changes. And the new Trump administration will be happy, for better and for worse, to push this process along. I don't think we should expect Harvard to go out of business anytime soon, but there will be significant changes. And some of the other significant changes that we're seeing, certainly since the later spring and across the summer. And I discussed some of this a little bit in the last BDS Monitor, so a week and a half ago. One is the rush towards institutional neutrality on the part of most academic institutions, that they they do not see a percentage anymore in expressing political statements about political issues outside of their immediate purview. So climate change, Hamas, Israel, uh, what have you. And this, I think, is very much a reaction against enormously bad publicity that they generated for themselves by clumsy responses to October 7th, by incredibly clumsy responses to congressional pressure and investigations, which really unraveled a lot of the shrouds that had covered the enterprise as a whole regarding competence, if nothing else. The other thing that's happening is the gradual dismantling of DEI initiatives, pushed largely, not largely, to a great extent, let's say, by Republican legislatures who are mandating or defunding DEI initiatives at state universities, but also by the institutions themselves realizing that these are bad, they create bad optics, as well as bad outcomes. And one of the big signs, I think, that this is not an operative uh, enterprise anymore came from the University of Michigan last week, where it the university announced that it would no longer require DEI statements from faculty who are applying for jobs or applying for promotions. And University of Michigan had constructed, it turned out, a $250 million a year enterprise to socially engineer its faculty through these kinds of through separate mechanisms of DEI, separate offices, which not only acted as ideological commissars overseeing the entire university, but which had the power and the money to install its own faculty here and there in the name of diversity and so on. That, I think, is gradually coming to an end. One can't attribute it all to President Trump, certainly, but I think the palpable failure of DEI within broader society, within universities, and the role of DEI bureaucracies in promoting and sustaining and supporting campus anti-Semitism since October 7th has played some kind of role. Uh, I I'm cautious about analogies, but I think that there's a kind of late Soviet vibe to the whole thing that, you know, this can't go on anymore. That the whole enterprise has to be reformed in some ways, nominal and otherwise, lest everything collapse. Um, Now, on the other hand, excuse me. On the other hand, um, I'm 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 I wrote down here dialectical materialism and the contradiction of social forces, and that's my little Marxian uh, fillip for today. Although I am a strict Marxian only in the Groucho terms. Who's doubling down? Who, in contradiction to all of these, let's call them positive changes, who's doubling down? The Democrats are doubling down. So we have 60% of Senate Democrats voting in favor of arms boycott against a full arms boycott against Israel for over Gaza. You have continued domination of the Democratic Party by the increasing domination of Democratic Party by progressive figures such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, um, who is being groomed or grooming herself into a leadership role. And I think personally that she's going to challenge Chuck Schumer in the next Senate race. Um, you have the faculty, not all of the faculty, of course. You have the pro BDS, pro Hamas faction of the faculty. So somewhere between 10 to, make a number, 15% maybe, of faculty doubling down, um, and setting themselves up as part of the resistance. One of the things I talked about in the last monitor was the declaration by the new-ish president of the American Association of University Professors that you know, boycotts against Israel, individual boycotts against Israel, are okay and great and moral, and that the AAUP should be a union in the sense of an actual labor union. You have the continued support from Faculty for Justice in Palestine chapters for for boycotts and condemnations of their own institutions for rejecting divestment. I should have said that one of the positive things is that almost all institutions who have been challenged about divestment with divestment petitions or resolutions or some other mechanism have rejected them, including, interestingly, Vassar last week. One would expect that Vassar, one of the crunchier sort of institutions in the American higher education landscape, would at least think about it, but they didn't, and it's done. And so the faculty has condemned them. You have students, most recently last week at Yale, who voted rather overwhelmingly in favor of a boycott, divestment resolution, which is very unlikely to move the corporation that runs the college, the university. So there is this process of doubling down, and I'll mention, the NGO sector doubling down. The Amnesty International report alleging quite disgustingly that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians of last week. And you have artists and writers doubling down. More boycotts, more petitions, more actions to isolate and eliminate and blacklist and blackmail cultural workers on the issue of Israel. Excuse me. And I think what we're seeing, again, to be slightly dialectical, is overeducated and overpopulated elites discrediting and marginalizing themselves. One of the questions is why, and I think part of the answer comes from what we've seen in the K through 12 sector with respect to transgenderism and the promotion thereof by schools and teachers and unions, which was very well documented in a report in the Free Press by Abigail Schreier, which mentioned in the last monitor. And that's because it's a way to power. It's a way for an institution, in that case K through 12, to retain power, to expand power, in this case over utterly vulnerable and individuals like children, on a trendy issue. But one of the things that she noted is that this is going away because it's been exposed, and it's palpably wrong and it's palpably abusive, and that the new thing is Israel and anti-Semitism, and that K through 12 unions, K through 12 teachers, and we've talked before on this broadcast and certainly in the monitor about the influence of foreign money, Qatari money in particular, on curriculums and so on. that this is a kind of natural, unnatural migration or evolution for um, elites who have been discredited in one area but want to retain their power to move into another area, another cause, and that's what we're seeing. The other thing that we're seeing, and I'll conclude with this, is actual violence. And anti-Semitic violence has increased tremendously since October 7th. There is survey after survey, poll after poll, which talks about which documents how Jews on campus, off campus, in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, and so on, feel unsafe, have been discriminated against, but also there are increasing acts of violence. The synagogue in Melbourne, which was burned down last week with 2 people in it who fortunately escaped. The synagogue in Toronto, which has been targeted now 7 times with gunfire. A car ramming by a Palestinian of an Israeli in Laguna Beach, California, which happened the other day. And on well, in this case on campus, where 2 Students for Justice in Palestine leaders were arrested after from George Mason University, were arrested after their house was searched, and lots of Hamas and Hezbollah flags were recovered along with unlicensed guns and ammunition. So there's a lot of this that's going on, and there's an unhinging, I think, in certain members of the Islamic leftist alliance, where violence is becoming more acceptable, and more popular, and um, and it's being celebrated. So I think we're in for very difficult and very interesting times. I don't know exactly what comes next, whether it's new institutions and new spaces for Jews involved in culture. That's already happening. I think that will intensify, and old spaces will suffer and wither. But how existing spaces are renegotiated, re-adjudicated, universities, corporations, um, the political life as a whole remains very unclear to me. And my hope is that we can avoid as much violence as possible. But that's my big concern. So that's a good place to stop, and let's maybe do some questions.
Right. Thank you, Alex, as always. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here. So let me just, before we go to the audience, let me just add one more to your last point, and I think it also worth dealing with, and you and I obviously have discussed this here. But so of course, now that we know that as far as the latest attack on the CEO of United Healthcare. Again, a byproduct of the Ivy Leagues. This individual by the name of alleged Luigi Meggianone, and his involvement, as a byproduct of the Ivy Leagues, and and going through all this. Yet, his whole activism as far as environmental and whatnot is yet another example where it kind of goes beyond the realm of the Israel part, but also touching on it, touch and go. We are seeing clearly, and this is something, to my point, that this is really a national security matter.
Right.
Uh, and are we seeing, with everything, with all the potential changes now, and obviously to your last point about George Mason, clearly there is, there's the variety of violations that are going on here regarding FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, on American college campuses. From what you're observing, I mean, are we seeing, is that being internalized, or is it being still, is it still, relegated, or put in a kind of a compartmentalizing regarding, this is a discrimination matter, apropos, the issue of the Office of Civil Rights, versus a national security matter. And do we think we can, national security will resonate more as far as causing much more changes within higher education?
Uh, well, let me back up to the beginning of your question. The alleged killer of the United Healthcare chief executive officer, he's a has 2 degrees from the University of Pennsylvania in computer science, and has a complicated story. And there's health issues, physical health issues, mental health issues involved with him. And it's too soon to say what the story is, particularly with him. What's interesting to me about this, terrible situation is the way that he was applauded by all too many people. There's an absolutely horrifying clip from Piers Morgan's interview show with with the now once again unemployed Taylor Lorenz, formerly columnist for the Washington Post, where she was cheering on the murder of this guy who this executive was the father of 3 people. And it's not like and she was and then she had to backtrack and say, well, I'm not in favor of killing more of healthcare executives. And I think that there is a component of American society, and certainly, world society, that has become sufficiently unhinged where revolutionary violence, that is, and terrorism, that is to say, propaganda by deed, is acceptable against, in this case, um, hated leaders of corporations. And you'd have to go back in American history 140, 120 years, 140 years to see these kinds of things playing out in the last Gilded Age, where moguls and things were targeted. But the way it's celebrated is extremely disturbing. And that's, I think, a manifestation of attitudes that have come partly out of academia, but also partly out of let's not be coy about it. Various, ethnic groups in American society have come out of various socioeconomic groups in American society, some of which are highly, highly educated, like Luigi Mangione. And this is an extremely dangerous development, and it's a huge domestic security threat, and it's a huge national security threat. Now, with respect to national security as a whole, hoping that Kash Patel will become head of the FBI. He's another individual who's taken anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence extremely seriously, and who's spoken explicitly about foreign involvement in uh, anti-Semitism and violence on American streets that's occurred since October 7th. Now, his mandate is to reform the FBI by destroying it in some fashion. As a sidebar, that's a very interesting. It's a very interesting problem. How do you reform a law enforcement institution that's taken on domestic intelligence responsibilities, but has become highly politicized in the process? And really, the way to do that is just to split everything into various pieces, and to get the FBI in particular out of the domestic intelligence and counterintelligence business, and have them focus on law enforcement and create something new. But we'll have to see. But as a whole, the incoming administration appears much more sensitive to issues of foreign funding, foreign involvement, foreign motivation, foreign participation. They have called, including from President Trump himself, called for the deportation of individuals who are found to be involved in anti-Semitic incidents and rioting on the streets. Now, some of this will inevitably run afoul of free speech considerations. It will be adjudicated in court. Some of it will get mixed up in the larger immigration question, and how the government will respond to that and how politics will respond to that. But I think that there's reason for, at least again, a sliver of hope that these issues will be taken seriously for the first time. I saw no real indication that the Biden administration, or the Trump administration that preceded it, took these issues terribly seriously. I think Trump didn't have any appreciation, and Biden essentially talked a little bit about it, but didn't do anything about it. So,
Great, thank you. So let me
excuse
go
me.
to the audience here and try to combine some questions that we have and try to tackle this. One question from Michael Holloway here is asking about the statement about the 60% of Democrats who voted to
Senate Democrats.
Senate Democrats, sorry, to vote this cut support for Israel. If you can expand on that. And in conjunction with that, another question that's coming in here about, we've spoken about anti-Semitism on the left. How about anti-Semitism on the right? When it comes to white supremacists and and hating us and whatnot. And can you talk about a little bit about those groups as a result? I'm adding here of the elections.
Uh, okay, well, let me I just looked this up very briefly. So it was the Bernie Sanders proposed resolution to block sales of tank rounds, mortar rounds, and guided munitions kits. So 19 Democrats against 18 Democrats against one, 19 Democrats against the other, 17 against one. Every Republican voted in favor of all these, and so that's a big number, and there are some of these Democrats, John Ossoff of Georgia, Dick Durbin, Jean Shaheen, Tim Kaine, not an Israel supporter by any means, Ed Markey of Massachusetts, Chris Murphy, Connecticut. Again, a lot of these, Chris Van Hollen, a lot of these are well-known Israel non-supporters, or Israel, we're going a little bit beyond non-supporters of Israel. The fact that they got so many votes at one time is very interesting and rather distressing. It's distressing, and it suggests that and all of these characters are going to have leadership roles within the Democratic Party as it moves to minority status in the new Congress. So, and the fact that all of these individuals voted for resolutions promoted by Sanders, whose rhetoric is obscene and absurd and extreme, is extremely extremely distressing, and it suggests to me that the mainstream of the party continues to be responsive to or even dominated by anti-Israel voices. Um, How to change that? Run better candidates, run more pro-Israel candidates, and support them. The there's not much more to say about that right now. We'll have to see who runs. I don't know when all of these individuals are up for re-election. The question of the far right is very interesting. In the past and historically, since the beginning of the modern BDS wave, the BDS movement goes back to the 60s and 70s, really, but the contemporary wave began after the Durban Conference in 2001, for a variety of reasons. Since that time, the far right has not been terribly interested in working with or supporting as such BDS. They have their own take on anti-Semitism. They have their own anti-Semites. They have very little political support uh, within the political mainstream of the country. They have relatively few candidates. There are a few exceptions. Thomas Massie is one exception. It does not appear as though he's terribly fond of Jews, much less Israel. And there are a couple more. I'd have to look up those names. There's nowhere near the critical mass of anti-Israel um, uh, congressmen, congresspeople that we saw, for example, with the Squad. Um, there's there seems to be tactical mutual support being given on a tactical basis in a few places. Michigan, Germany. The political dynamics in Germany are obviously extremely different, and the historical background there is obviously extremely different. And the propensity to violence is is generally, I would say, higher on this far right neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and so on. Part of the problem is that what we saw during the presidential campaign, we had a year of any opponent of um, Kamala Harris being accused of being a neo-Nazi and a white supremacist, and this rather diluted the meaning of those terms and the reality behind those terms, which is real, so to speak. But it's important not to overstate it. Now, there is a kind of more broadly based political and cultural trend. I don't want to call it a movement, but it's a trend towards a certain kinds of isolationist tendencies on the part of Americans, reflected in negative attitudes towards foreign aid, foreign involvement in foreign wars. Certainly, much of this is a reaction against belatedly, I think, the Iraq War. Some of this is a reaction to Ukraine and what appears to be uncritical support and unlimited funding provided to the government of Ukraine. And some of this is out and out, kind of xenophobia, racism, including anti-Semitism. This has helped the Republican Party as a whole. I don't know that it is. It's difficult for me to quantify the threat. It certainly has very little relevance to Israel boycotts per se and divestments, and the BDS movement as a whole. It may have some relevance going forward with respect to American political and economic or military support, not economic support, for Israel going forward. There's this expectation on the part of certainly a lot of American Jews that there's and the modern the Israeli government, the present Israeli government, that the election of Donald Trump means a carte blanche for Israel and the Netanyahu government in particular. And I think that this is very mistaken, that there will be real limits and constraints and placed on it at some point. And what it looks like, I don't really know. I don't think it's going to be boycotts as such. I don't think it's going to be supporting or United Nations Security Council resolutions against Israel, anything like that. But there'll be a lot of subtle pressure. Trump has already said that he wants the Gaza war ended with an Israeli victory. And but I think there are many different conceptions of what an Israeli victory is going to look like. So we're going to see. So I don't think it's I don't think it's wise to be sanguine about the far right at all. Um, and I think that, but I think that the threats are somewhat different. It's less of a political threat. It's less of a threat to dominate or move a political party, including in that case the Republicans, than it is from the left and their ability to move the Democratic Party. But I think in terms of a physical threat to American Jews, that it's not insignificant. So
Great. Thank you for that. And again, being sanguine about a lot of things is hard to these days, but we are trying to. But there's, looking for those slivers that you mentioned, yeah,
slivers.
in your presentation, obviously, is what we're hoping for. Next question by our friend Barbara Tuchel, who's asking about, obviously related to the recent events in Syria and the toppling of the Assad regime. We've addressed this in some angles, but obviously to expand on this, given the fact that the brutality of the Assad regime and and what he's done to his people, what's seeing now, is there any thought in your mind that it comes to that that the actual genocide being committed by dictators like Assad will take away from the genocidal claims, quote unquote, committed by Israel, within the constellation of this war, and in general, obviously, this is the genocide, the quote, the ongoing genocidal claim that has been thrown against
No,
Israel time and
it won't
time.
make any difference.
Yeah.
Um, they all of these and I have to be very careful because I have a very negative attitude towards international institutions and the concept of human rights. All of these entities could have indicted the Assad regime or the Turkish regime or Iran many years ago for all sorts of crimes which murdered hundreds of thousands of people, and they never did, and they're not going to, in my estimation. And human rights organizations will, uh, to feel embarrassment, you need to be able to feel shame. And I don't really think that any of these people can do that or will do that. And I think that normal people, um, let's include ourselves here, who have a sense of perspective and proportion will go, well, you didn't for this, but you do for that, and here's the number for this, and here's the alleged number for that. And this will, I think, to some small degree, intensify the discrediting of human rights organizations and international institutions and universities, where students and faculty are going to get up and continue to complain and bemoan. No, bemoan's not the right word. To protest Israeli genocide and and then accuse anybody else who says, well, Syria, to accuse them of whataboutism, to try and diminish the important case where the Jews killed people from the case, oh, that happened already, in the past, and with the Syrians or the Eritreans or the Sudanese or all these other places and peoples where the bloodshed was vast and palpable and inescapable and was ignored. So the long and the short of it is, I don't think it's gonna make too much of a difference, except for a certain number of normal people, and hopefully that number of normal people who are now maybe not feeling quite so constrained in a new cultural environment where you have a president who speaks his mind quite freely about all sorts of things, for better and for worse. Maybe that will make a little bit of change.
And to to add, obviously all this is amplified by the entire human rights industry that, of course, has been used by the International Court of Justice, and you mentioned the Amnesty report, all these quote unquote factual documentations that lead to, of course, predetermined conclusions that are detached from reality. But of course, it
Right.
is.
Well, I think the Amnesty report is a very interesting one. I haven't read it yet. I just haven't had the time, or possibly the stomach. But even before it came out, people got hold of it and went through it and said, people on our side, so to speak, and said, well, this is wrong. This is a lie. This is made up. This is nonsense. This is ignored. And it's not as if the Amnesty report didn't have an impact, but it didn't have the same impact that it would have had 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, because media and social media are not dominated the same way by institutions, and not given who are not given the same kind of uncritical attention and uncritical respect that they were even a few years ago. And that's all to the good. And it will cut both ways, but more information is good. I read an article today in Chronicle of Higher Education where an academic was complaining that the worst thing that's ever happened is to academia and the world is that Elon Musk bought Twitter, and it's just become a cesspool of uncontrolled information, and academics have to create their own platforms. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fine. Do it. Do it. Um, but you want to compete, go compete. And maybe they will, and maybe they won't. But I think in the modern world, in modern history, that one that one small purchase, it only cost him $43 billion, was one of the most significant purchases, because it began to break the monopoly that the media had on information and voices. And you try and get something into the Washington Post or the New York Times saying, no, 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 this is a lie. Amnesty is literally lying about genocide. No, that's all right. We're going to go with our narratives. Now you have a billion narratives, which is good and bad, and takes a lot of time to keep up with it. It's a lot of effort, but that's the only way to proceed for the time being, until we can rebuild a society of trust in individuals and information and institutions, which we do not have. And because there have been too many lies, and we see it in our sector with our concerns. Too many lies. So
100%. And I think, and unfortunately, that's a good place to end. I think that, unfortunately, our time is running short. But obviously, going back to your earlier point, about those slivers of optimism.
Slivers.
Yeah, we will hope and aim for that, post, after January 20th and see what happens. Hoping, obviously, we know, but bureaucracies do not move very quickly, but we do hope there will be some kind of measurable outcomes as far as transparency when it comes to
Right.
dealing with our sector.
And the fight will continue in other areas. So
Right.
anti-Semitism is not going to go away. But maybe colleges, universities can maybe.
Maybe.
So
We hope.
we will be hopeful because we go now into the
Of
season of
hope.
hope for Jews and Christians alike. So
That's
let's keep that in mind.
we'll focus on that. But as always, Alex, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joined us this afternoon. Obviously, we did not get to all your questions, and we apologize for that. Feel free to email us after this webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. Be on the lookout for future webinars. We will probably resume our sessions right after New Year's. So let me take this opportunity to wish everybody a happy holiday season and a happy New Year. Hoping more positive, for more positivity all around in those slivers of constellations that we are looking for. And of course, be on the lookout for more material that will be coming out. And as always, we thank you for your ongoing support and interest in all the work that we're doing. So wish everybody a good day and a happy holiday season. So thank you very much and take care.
Take care.